Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 25 of the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. Today, we're going to talk about trauma and criminal thinking, and we got the band back together today. This is the first time in 3 weeks, both Jerry and Curt were able to make it. So welcome back, boys. And we have a great special guest to cover this topic with it, my good friend, Russha. Russha, I was trying to think about when we met, and I think we met by organizing a resource fair for somebody. And I just remember Russha's one of those people I talk to, and she had that just brilliant mix of passion and brilliance. And I think we've been having a conversation ever since in one way or the other. So I almost like to call this episode 1 of Russha joining us to talk about common interest, and was also just, and I know I thanked you a million times for this, was just a great help in writing my book, Connecting Paradigms. She, after my wife read it to make sure it was even readable, Russha really helped me with that. She's a great thinker around criminal justice, motivational interviewing, trauma, and neurobiology. So I can't think of a better person to have on this topic with us. So welcome, my friend. It's so great to have you. And you get the whole crew today, too. So welcome to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast.
Oh, thanks, Matt.
So we're going to start out with bright, shiny objects. We haven't done this in a couple weeks, too. So I'll start us out here. And one of the things that I've been really impressed, both that if you listen to the last episode on trauma-sensitive school conference that Jerry and I went to, and also a meeting I had with mental health providers in Colorado. It's really cool to start to watch communities and systems organize around becoming trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, trauma-responsive, whatever kind of thing we put behind the word trauma. But there's some really cool stuff happening at the system level. I know in Colorado too, we're going to start an initiative on trauma-sensitive schools moving forward as well. So it's just really, again, as someone who was just kind of in a room by myself talking about the ACE study 13 years ago, to see roomfuls of people from different expertise areas gathering together to say, how do we really create trauma-informed systems and trauma-informed communities, it just brings a smile to my face. I think, going to some of these meetings, you see the challenges of that, but boy, to get to this level of thinking is just a really a cool thing to see. And I know I just want to thank Jerry for leading some of that effort in the state of Colorado as well. I know he's done some amazing work with that. So Curt, what's your bright, shiny object of the week, my friend?
It's really similar to yours. I've had some really fun, enjoyable interactions over the last several weeks about blending a trauma-informed approach to a field that typically has been really kind of dominated by applied behavior analysis, and that's the field of autism. Mm-hmm. And bringing an approach to that treatment that really expands on the good things that ABA can bring to that field, but also that recognition of very much a mental health aspect to that field and to that group of people. Really have some enjoyable interactions in that sense, and some really great collaborations with some wonderful organizations and with some departments within the state. So I've really had a good time doing that.
Awesome. And I've got so many great comments about our autism podcast a couple weeks ago. So if people haven't been able to see that, it's my wife tells me like, oh, that autism episode was great. So she's told me like 8 times now. So she really likes it. And I've gotten that feedback from several other people who have taken the time to listen to it. Even if autism's not your main focus, we work with so many people that might be somewhere on the autism spectrum that it's really worth your time. And I've been constantly thinking about that since we left our friends over there in Utah. So absolutely, very cool.
The prevalence levels of autism and how rapidly they're increasing in our society. It's almost like if you don't know somebody who's affected by autism today, you will soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just increasing at a level that we've got to get organized around and do the right thing around.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very cool. Hey, and I just realized you shaved your beard too. I was like, something's different with Curt. So if you're on the video and want to see,
my face looks shorter to me now.
It's spring. It must be March. Spring is here. So that's what it was. I was like, did you get a haircut? Should I mention something? But it's clean shaven, looking good. So, Gary, what about you? What's your bright, shiny object of the week, my friend?
Well, my bright, shiny object this week is that I was in two different meetings. One was a meeting in which they were talking about the use of evidence-based treatment for trauma. Researched, randomized trials of really good replication of treatment approaches, and they're really pushed for people to use those. And then I went to, I had the good fortune to go to a Buddhist bowl singing concert and meditation which was 250,000 years of people sitting down and healing trauma. That's supposedly not evidence-based. And so I, sitting on the two ends of this spectrum is that trauma is not new. Societies and cultures have had rituals and practices to deal with this stuff. And it's just interesting for us as a culture about how we want to measure everything and how we want to just get it right. And in some ways, it's constant rediscovering what has been known is that being connected both with social context and being connected to our bodies is really about helping us move from being exposed to something that's adverse that could really harm us to having that be a positive growth experience for us. So I was in these two worlds this week, and I really I enjoyed being in both of them.
Very cool, very cool. I've seen some practitioners use the bowls in healing practice, and boy, is it really freaking cool.
Yeah, they put it on my head. I thought I was going to get a haircut, so I was like...
Oh, Jerry. Russha, my friend, what's something you're thinking about in the recent past?
Actually, right now, my bright, shiny object is I'm reading a book called The Fifth Dimension, and it's about systems and how systems create change. And it's a fantastic read, especially right now with all of the discussions that are going on in regards to gun violence in our schools and what that means for the arguments about arming teachers, about how do we create gun reform that will make sense or not create any gun reform, mental health care in our communities, all of that. And so likely it's not one simple answer. And so when we're thinking about how do we create healthy trauma-informed communities, it's probably going to be all of these things are going to have to come together, but the answers may likely be more simple than we think that they are.
Very cool. Is that Peterson Jay's work by chance?
Yeah.
Oh, I love Peterson Jay.
Yeah, right.
I know Jerry's a big fan too. So that book, I blame that book. I picked it up in a communication class or somewhere that I was trying to get my graduate in psychology, and I sort of blame Peter for all my student loan debt that I went off and got an MBA. So yeah, that book is so much because it was like I was thinking about like management and leadership, and I was all into psychology stuff, and boy, did he take both of those worlds and show me the possibilities and systems thinking and way beyond. So
right.
Fifth discipline, dance of change, all those have been big impactful things in my thinking throughout the years as well. So yeah, I think Jerry hired me because on the interview, I'm sure he doesn't remember this, I threw out some Peterson Jay, and we talked about the fifth discipline a little bit. So I count that for a little bit of why we know each other even. So let's get into a really powerful question here. And I think a question that's pretty simple for me to ask, but might be very, very much more complex to answer. And that's when we look at things like the ACE study and other studies, when you see ACE studies of folks done who are in the criminal justice system, we see this predictive factor like we've talked about the past with health issues like HIV, certain behaviors, and other things, success or failure in schools, is that we see that folks with that complex trauma, that high adverse childhood experience scores, have a higher risk of future involvement in the criminal justice system. So there seems to be this relationship of trauma, and later on, I don't know if anybody studied what that delay per se is, that the folks that have that unhealed trauma often then end up in the criminal justice system. And Russha, I just, as somebody who's thought a lot about trauma-informed over the years, and maybe introduce a little bit about who you are in your work here in Colorado with the criminal justice system, just sort of your thinking as you've, I know, evolved in your roles and trainings and all that over the years as well.
Yeah, I started working 18 years ago in a group home in Colorado. I was doing counseling and therapy for kids who were placed out of home either by Division of Youth Services or Department of Human Services. And so really started, I would say that job blossomed for me in regards to understanding the impact of trauma, not only on family systems, but even on the individual, who is then, they end up in trouble. They end up involved in the criminal justice system. So since then, I've actually left and have worked for the state in various different roles over the years, and both direct care and more administrative and analytical roles. But regardless of the role that I worked in, it's been very, very clear to me that the impact of trauma plays a huge role on a person's resiliency, on a person's problem-solving skills, on a person's executive functioning skills, and the development of those. And the really high prevalence rate of people who are involved in juvenile justice and criminal justice and have had some sort of exposure to trauma, and the impact that has played on their lives is huge. And then being a part of the criminal justice system, there's a very humbling awareness that I've had for a long time. And I had to develop and cultivate this awareness. I'm lucky to have worked with some pretty amazing families, but just involvement in the criminal justice system is really traumatic for people. We aren't really set up to be, to practice trauma-informed care. And now as a parent myself, I can't imagine what that must be like to have my child removed from my home and placed in the care of somebody else and not know every night if they're okay, if they're safe, if they're still in their bed, or what's going on with them. That'd be really stressful. And so then just kind of the concentric layers of stress and trauma that puts on a family, and then puts on a community is really mind-blowing. And I've worked in all sorts of communities in Colorado, from very upper middle class, affluent communities to lower socioeconomic communities. And what's really striking is that for those families that are in those upper socioeconomic communities, the ostracism, oh my gosh, now I can't say that word, but those families get really ostracized by their friends, by their neighbors, because if their kid got in trouble, then all of a sudden they're the ones that caused all the problems of the community, and that family is completely shunned. And the harassment that they experience on an ongoing basis can be at times pretty harmful. And So there are just all sorts of ways that involvement in the criminal justice system brings its own set of traumatic experiences in ways that I don't think people who work in those systems necessarily planned for or predicted. And certainly it's really hard when you're working with people who are experiencing that.
Absolutely. I think great point. I want to shift to I've got a big question for Curt, but I want to shift to Jerry first is, you know, Jerry, I think about our experience, our shared experience in child welfare systems. And I started out my career in juvenile justice and shifted in, and there was a little difference in those kids, but not a ton. You know, sometimes I think that my child welfare kids just didn't get caught with their crimes where my juvenile justice kids did. But saw both of those having really this intense history of trauma. Again, whether it was, you know, doing that. And just as Rush is talking too, I think in child welfare, we become so sensitive about taking a child out of the home, knowing that could be traumatizing for both the family and the kid. And yet you know, I think back to my criminal justice days, and if you committed a crime, you were going to be taken out of the home without much thought or transition there as well. So I just kind of want to get your experience with this, especially with the youth population that you've worked with, and just this relationship between trauma and criminal behavior that you've seen throughout your work.
You know, that's a good question. And I think there's a subtle difference between ending up in the youth correctional system versus the child, even though they're actually combined.
Yeah.
In that, in some ways, in one system, we see the child as the victim, and in another, they see that child being the perpetrator. So that's somewhat different, although I think your experience of interacting with both of them, the high exposure to violence and neglect is prevalent in both of these systems. But I do agree with Russha about talking about the impact of being removed from your familiar surroundings and placed in an environment where you're cared for someone else. Our biology, by nature, is designed to be on high alert in those kind of situations. The level of novelty, the level of unfamiliarity, and so by being in a defensive position and responding that way, there's a way more likelihood of future events of aggression and future events, which kinds of leads further into the system, as opposed to setting up the system really to help down-regulate that stress response and creating a sense of safety. We've in some ways created situations where our interventions actually increase the risk of future events. So I think really insightful thinking about how the system itself perpetrates the very kind of outcomes it was trying to prevent in some ways. And I see that in child welfare as well. So.
Absolutely. Curt, I'm going to go to you because I'm really interested in your thoughts from you, again, that behavioralist perspective that you bring. Because again, a lot of times, most every time's involvement in this criminal justice system mean you engaged in a behavior to get there. And yet we see this, if we take a step back and take a breath, we see a lot of times, most of the time from the research I've seen, a really intense trauma history with a lot of these folks. And I just kind of, as you kind of look at that progression from psychological pain and suffering to a criminal act, I just kind of want to get your thoughts. I know I'm asking you a pretty complex question when I do so, but I just kind of want to get your thinking around that.
Well, in about 1974, was the known as the father of radical behaviorism, B.F. Skinner, wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Mm-hmm. And in that book, he raised a lot of questions like this. And one of them is, how do we assign credit and how do we assign blame? That's one of the fundamental questions of society. And one of the things that the behavior analytic view does is to take the causes of behavior and put them solidly in the environment, not inside of the person. And that helps to start to answer that question of assigning credit or assigning blame to things more than just it's because that person was creative. They were in an environment that also supported creative responses, or it's not that that person is criminal. They were in an environment that supported or led them down that road. And so I think that is a really one of the areas of overlap between the trauma-informed approach and a behavioral approach that philosophically agrees 100%, right? That you take the causes of behavior and you answer that question with much more than what is wrong with this person, and incorporate what has happened to them, and what are the environmental things that have kind of slowly led them down that path, right? I mean, that's what we call a learning history or a reinforcement history, that those things start to send people in different trajectories of their behavior.
Yeah. So I want to open this sort of follow-up question up to everybody, because it's one I get, but I still struggle with to some extent. So let's say somebody comes from a very traumatic home situation, and for so many of my kids too, their communities and neighborhoods were also dangerous places, and a lot of their schools weren't safe places. So they grow up surrounded by some of this criminal behavior. They've experienced trauma in many different ways. And then let's say at age 21, they decide to pick up a gun and go rob a store. Now, we know that someone with trauma has a higher risk of doing such of a behavior, but I think a lot of people, including myself, if you ask me the question, I have to kind of struggle around it, because there seems to be a volitional choice that the individual has to pick up that gun and go rob the store. Yet we know if there's that trauma background, they're much more likely to do such a behavior. And I just kind of wonder if, now that I got like 3 experts on this call with me, what would you say to help sort of explain that, yeah, this behavior is terrible. None of us want that in our community, but something happened to this individual, connecting it up to that person's choice to grab a gun and rob a store, or go and break into somebody's house. And so I kind of wonder, help me answer that question to folks when they do ask it to me.
I mean, maybe one way to kind of even think about it is to take what drives our emotional reaction to even hearing about that, right? So I hear about that example and I think that I want justice. I want somebody to pay for that. Right, and that, I mean, I'm reading a lot of Robert Sapolsky's work now, so I'm kind of going to steal some of that stuff, right? But I mean, the part of the brain that gives us that feeling of disgust is the same part of the brain that gives us the feeling of disgust when we taste bad food and want to get rid of it. And so it's really evolutionarily a part of our system. And so when we see things that are morally disgusting, same brain area as disgusting taste. And so we've evolved this way in a way that really can benefit our society, right? It can deter me from doing those things. It also gives me feelings about somebody else who does them that would give me the urge to provide social censure to those things and to direct it a different way. And so those parts of our brains that tied to how we feel about things really can help us as a society. They can also trip us up. So thinking about, as we think about what we learn about how the brain has evolved, how the brain functions, and the overlap between these things can help us to, again, ask the question and look for answers in a variety of different areas that we may not have looked before.
Great.
So, that's kind of I'm notorious for a long answer to a short question, but.
I think this is one of the more complex questions with the trauma-informed criminal justice sort of movement. Jerry, what's your thoughts?
Well, I like what Curt said, but I want to take it in a little different direction. And I want to kind of go back to Peterson Jay a little bit and think about it from a systemic perspective. Is that when an event of violence happens in the community, that's a single event. And we have this physiological reaction to this single event. and we want to kind of respond to that single event and get rid of it, like spit it out, as using the same analogy. But if you go below that, is really this concept that Sandra Bloom talks about, Peterson Jay talks about, from a systemic, but it's a collective disturbance. So we go to the place of the disturbance and get rid of disturbance, but we never really look underneath and say, what were the mental models? What were the underlying reasons that led to that moment, right? And you could go back to a millisecond before and look inside the person and say, what was the physiological reactions that were going on? Or you could go back even further and look out into the interpersonal, community, cultural, historical perspectives that led to that moment. And so I think that when we try to solve problems by looking at events, instead of looking at the context in which those events occurred, we tend to, in some ways, get involved in a reenactment over and over and over again of trying to solve the same events, rather than getting to the underlying causes of those events and seeing it from a systemic perspective. So that's really, it isn't that we shouldn't respond to that event, but our response to that single event won't take care of what all the factors that led up to that.
Absolutely. So Russha, I'm coming to you now. I think it got more complex for you, not less complex. I want to throw in, again, I realize how deep I'm digging here. I obviously agree totally with what Curt said, what Jerry said, all those things, obviously. And the person picks up a gun still, maybe makes a choice. I think that is the difficult thing, but something happens where they end up in the store or in a home and commits the crime. So I kind of want to get your thinking on this, especially from somebody within that system who really, even though I know you're doing amazing work in Colorado, we at least my experience with being in the criminal justice system, we focus so much on the actual act. There isn't much space sometimes to breathe and say, okay, what's happened to this person? So kind of want to get your thoughts on this from somebody who's currently and has been inside that system, working for improvements and change all these years too.
I think that kind of adding on to what Jerry said, the first thing that came to mind was that this is kind of a neurobiological no-dot, right? That here's this kid or young adult who really is probably very amygdala driven. And when you live in a system, in a community where you struggle to get food, your family needs something from you, and you may be looked at as one of the caregivers for the family, and you have to figure out how you're going to make ends meet, and this is how you've seen problems be solved your whole life, this is what's going to happen. And I think that when working with people who make these decisions, the question at some point always has to become, why? What happened? What was going on? Tell me about the rest of your life. And one of the things that I found really working with all ages is that there are very few, probably on less than one hand could I count the people that I've worked with who never experienced a lot of trauma. So we're talking about 10 or 15 years of direct care work, hundreds and hundreds of kids and young adults, and maybe 3 haven't experienced trauma. So one of the things that I found was that until somebody could slow down and really validate and talk to them about their trauma in an empathetic way and justify for them that it was wrong, did they ever understand how their actions really impacted other people. They had to have that empathy developed in a relationship that was safe for them about what happened to them. And then they were able to really approach their crimes from this empathetic place and say, oh, now I get what I did. Now I see what happened. Now I see the impact of my choices and my behaviors. Now I can really start understanding why there's some importance for me to learn how to make different choices. Now I can understand why it's important for me to learn these skills that you want me to learn in group. And and I would couple that with the importance of kids, young adults, any age adult really understanding and having the experience of getting some mastery over how to control those emotions, because we all feel at some point we all get hijacked. We're all susceptible to that. But really, you don't understand the importance of being able to mindfully bring yourself down from that hijack until you can experience it happening. And then you think, oh, that outcome was way better for me and everybody around me, and I can have some mastery over that. So I think kind of both of those things working together really help the person move forward and move past bad decisions that they've made.
Absolutely.
I think at some point, we've all really made bad decisions, and we've all had to really figure out how to regroup and move past that. But the communities, the support systems that we have, and the skills that we have may all look really different. So I might have made a bad decision, but I have a really strong community of friends around me. I have a really pro-social, strong family who will support me. I have a great job where I'm surrounded by pro-social people. And so I'm able to really draw from my resources to move forward. And so then how do we use those experiences ourselves and the empathy that we might be able to bring to the table to help people develop those same skills and to find that empathy, because I think that everybody has that in them.
Absolutely.
So I have my family has involvement in criminal justice in kind of an interesting way, right? My father is a judge, retired now, and so he was, did that for 30 years. My brother just retired from the Department of Corrections. He was a probation officer and a prison guard, and his wife is also a prison guard. And I'm thinking of we've had a lot of these kinds of discussions, and they've been really, really interesting, right? When you think of some of the dilemmas that we have to balance, if we want to be trauma informed, right, within a criminal justice system and a correctional system, that is what it is, right? It is what it is. And we can go through reform, great, right? That's part of why we're doing this, right? But one of the major dilemmas we have to balance is our responsibility to protect others and our responsibility to focus on rehabilitation and do better for society for this person. And that's a dilemma that has to get balanced in such a fundamental way in the criminal justice system that I imagine just people hopping on both sides of that fence like all the time, and I can hear some of the questions my dad would ask me. I can hear some of the questions my brother would ask me about, and certainly their experience has mirrored, what you say, Russha, that everybody that they talk to, all of the inmates that they go through, like all have, when I talked to them about the ACEs study, they were like, oh my goodness, everybody's got an ACEs score of 7+, right? Everybody. So, I mean, there's no question that there is just massive levels and prevalence of adverse childhood experiences and traumatic experiences among that population. And we also simultaneously have the responsibility to protect other people who were injured, right? So that I'm wondering, like, just some thoughts on both sides of that dilemma. It'll get back to that dilemma at some point in the conversation.
Yeah, and let me throw something else in there too. One is I didn't know which direction Curt was going to go with his family's involvement in criminal justice. So I was like, "Wow,
I'd give you a little pause.
Very interesting place." So I figured it was more on that side, but I thought we might get some good stories out of that. So, but let me. I just want to throw because this is sort of my thinking and add it to what Curt just said too. Is how does this help us think about mental health services in schools and other I would say preventative measures if we're looking at from a criminal justice perspective. So let me throw that in there as well with kind of Curt's question, Russha. How's this make you think about trauma-informed schools and mental health and other interventions that are so in our face in our country right now in so many ways?
Yeah, so solve the world's problems.
Yes.
The next
yeah, great. I can't solve anybody's problems, but I think that first, to get to Curt's point, what you said is the crux of the issue, right? Like I think criminal justice professionals are faced every day with some pretty horrific stories and realities about the people that they get to work with. And the goal should always be, I believe, long-term behavior change. And in my experience, it's harder to get to that long-term behavior change if you cannot approach them from a place of empathy and work through that trauma with that person and simultaneously work on the skill building. And with that then becomes that community safety and becomes that victim reparation and becomes that opportunity for restorative justice. But I don't think, I think that what the criminal justice system is really susceptible to is creating a bunch of professionals who are also highly traumatized themselves, because you listen to these stories and you work with these people and this is all you deal with all day. This is the place you live in. And without having some really strong self-care skills that really aren't taught to you. You're not taught those skills in school. You're not taught those skills in any of your on-the-job training or any of the professional development trainings you go to. You at some point can become really callous and can become very much, listen, my job is to keep the community safe from you, and you are scary. And so the easiest thing is to remove you from the community or lock you up or whatever the decision may be. And I think then we put those people in a system, like Jerry said, that continues to perpetuate this development of skills that is contrary to really what the system is trying to do in regards to outcomes. I think that, Matt, to your point, one of the most difficult things is the fact that since I graduated with my undergrad and have worked in the system, that mental health funding continuously gets cut. I think that we inadvertently and purposefully put a lot of onus back on schools, on faith-based organizations, but really the agencies who are designed to and trained to deal with a lot of these more mental health issues that exist, we keep stripping their funding for tons of reasons, whether it's because we're in a recession or because suddenly the political powers that are in a position to make change, their values don't align with funding those agencies. But we continue to take away from those agencies, and that's not how all criminal justice systems are set up. There are other systems in the world where people will come in and they look at the case and they say, oh, you committed these crimes because you have a substance abuse disorder, your case is closed, you're going to this other system, and they get care for their substance abuse disorder. Or you committed this crime because you have mental health issues, we're closing your case and you're going to this other system of care where we can help you with your mental health issues. Those options don't exist here. Between the school system and the criminal justice system, now and faith-based organizations, I feel like those three systems have been asked to solve a myriad of issues. And quite frankly, criminal justice professionals are not therapists. We're not trained to deal with therapeutic issues. We're not trained to do a lot of the things that we're asked to do, just like schools aren't and a lot of faith-based organizations aren't. But we become that center hub to deal with a ton of systemic issues, from housing and being able to get food on the table, to helping people find jobs and just get IDs, to more therapeutic services, therapy, mental health, substance abuse disorders, so on and so forth. And really what we should be dealing with are kind of the patterns of thinking that led people to make a decision to pick up a gun and go rob a store. That's what we're trained to do. That's what we're designed to do. That's what we should be doing.
Awesome. Jerry, I want you to jump in here. What are your what are some of your thoughts?
Completely different direction.
I think the word dilemma really kind of challenges us to hold all these pieces, not to get organized by one part of the problem. And really see. And I think once we get into discussions, we tend to get organized around one part of this issue and not the whole part. But I do want to kind of create a parallel between when there's some act of violence, it creates a biological response in all of us to protect ourselves, which is not very different than what happens when you're exposed to ACEs, right? You develop a strategy to protect yourself. And that may have initially have been a really good survival strategy. But when that strategy continues to go on, irregardless of what it actually keeps you safe or not, then it becomes maladaptive. And I think Curt's point was people say is, well, we got to keep communities safe. Well, the data doesn't support that what we're doing actually keeps people safe.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And
There's
so
long-term.
we're more in a repetition than we are in a problem-solving strategy to kind of look at that. And this kind of interested me because I've got into so many of these discussions around gun rights. So I went back in history and wanted to started to understand where did the concept of gun rights in our Constitution come from. And when you look at the history of it, really the history of came really back from England. And in England, the kings didn't have major armies. So all of the people were mandated to have guns so that if the kingdom was being in some ways attacked, they were called to protect to protect their king, right? And then it came here, and really the states and didn't really have, the colonies didn't have the ability to protect themselves from the Native Americans. So they all had weapons. And then in the Revolution, the English started to go around collecting everybody's guns as a way to kind of do it. So then they wrote into the Constitution that we have the right to have guns. But in the Constitution, it changed to we needed to have guns just in case the government became corrupt and we were going to be organized, because there wasn't a large state militias. There wasn't a National Guards or any of that. In that time, the people were that. So when you look at the history of why we needed to have guns, there was actually really good reasons for it. What we do today to justify why we have guns has nothing really to do with the really original reason that it came. And so when we engage in these discussions, we have to look at it from a historical perspective and understand that creating these kinds of, in some ways, kicking people out of the tribe when they committed a crime in the tribe was probably the best solution that people had at the time to solve those problems. And they didn't actually go into prisons. They got kicked out in the lionate. You know, that was the nature of it. So we've got to be able to both hold the problem, but find more creative, innovative solutions to actually make us safe and to grow and develop, as opposed to get stuck in doing the same thing over and over again. And I think that when we sit down to the table and we argue positions, we never get to new solutions.
Yeah.
We hold on, whether we're arguing for putting people in or not putting people in, it's still arguing a position. Rather than saying, how do we come together and find more innovative solutions? And I think, restorative justice is a new solution. And what would that look like? And there's other ways to kind of look at this. But it's very hard for us when we're all feeling unsafe to engage in those kind of higher order kind of discussions around these dilemmas that I think Curt kind of held it. And I think that's how you solve dilemmas. You hold all the parts of the dilemma, and then you come to some meta solution, rather than staying in, either putting him in or not putting him in. That is a binary. It's like it's a one zero or one solution.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We need to get to a much more sophisticated solution to solve these problems.
Yeah. And I want to share one of the things, because I want to get everybody's opinion a little kind of quick around the loop with the time we have left on how could trauma-informed criminal justice reform? And I know that that's probably a whole podcast within of itself, but one of the things that I really love that I saw come out is when I went and did a training in Honolulu, Hawaii. I spent a day, because this is my life, at the Women's Community Correctional Center, the women's prison, the only women's prison in the state of Hawaii. And I met this Mark Warren, who's the warden of that prison, and he was using this concept of, and I butcher this word, and I'll only try to use it once, but it's hoo-hoo now, and that's an Indiana boy trying to say a Hawaiian word, which doesn't work very well. But it translated into sanctuary. And what I know about, and I read a little bit because it was a long plane ride. I was doing a training out in Connecticut and flying to Honolulu. So I had a lot of time to read. And I read a book about Hawaii and the history of Hawaii. And one of the things that he said in the book supported was there was a lot of taboos in traditional Hawaiian society. You can kind of think of those as our laws and our norms in our society today. And if you broke these, the regular kind of justice system of the community was really harsh in those traditional societies. But there was this place, this puhunau, this sanctuary, that if the person could reach that, and a lot of times it sounds like people were maybe even chasing this individual to try to get them before they got here, that there was this sanctuary that they could get to, and it was sanctioned by the king. It was kind of the king's beach house from what I've read. And if they got to that, then they worked with the shaman. So there was a spiritual, I doubt they used the word, but psychological, physical healing process that went on. In other words, in our modern context, there was rehabilitation happening. And then what I thought was beautiful about this model as well is in that the shaman worked, because you didn't mess with the shaman in traditional cultures, because the shaman had some crazy powers. The shaman worked with the community to reintegrate the person back in. So that's sort of restorative justice mode. And what I love about Mark Warren's work is he's trying to create a similar model in his prison. And I just thought that it was beautiful that he could reach back into his culture's history and find, in some ways, granted the community was trying to kill the individual so they wouldn't reach this sanctuary, but actually the state provided a healing place. And I just thought that was fascinating model of criminal justice, and it stuck with me for several years. So as we look at these models, and I have heard around the country, and it's not something I wish it was more widespread, but there are trauma courts now where we're seeing it. I think I've only heard about a handful of these, but you know, Curt, like you're saying, ACE scores of 7, we're starting to realize scientifically doesn't make sense to necessarily stick that person in prison where they're going to experience more trauma. It's not really healing. So I just kind of want to go around in the limited time we have left. And if you were kind of to look at, you know, just something that we could do, not pointing the finger at the criminal justice system, but something as community members that we would like to see the criminal justice system considered reform-wise, I just kind of want to just a thought that you might have. And Curt, I'll kind of start with you. What if you could, again, a very deep question, but if there's something you'd like us to look at of moving to a trauma-informed criminal justice system, what might that be?
I mean, I think the idea of really the repetition of experiences would be an important one, right? I'm going to give you a short example. I hope that kind of shows you how balancing two sides of a dilemma could work. So I worked in supervised a correctional program, and we'd get, you know, lots of kids coming out of the detention centers as a step down into a residential placement. And we would get into this dilemma a lot, right? When you would get kids in the residential placement and it just wasn't working. Right? Their symptoms were not contained in that environment, right? It was too loose. It wasn't a match. Right? And so we would have to go through this dilemma of, when do we say enough is enough and people are getting hurt? And so we would have to kind of go through that a lot. And historically, really the organization had said, we never kick anybody out. And that would end up regenerating, like people getting hurt over and over and over again. And we really had to wrestle with that and sit on kind of both sides of that dilemma. And we decided that what we would do we would have a standardized kind of decision-making process that was asking every single month or every single week, whenever we had kind of a meeting around how things were going with this case, is this working? And if we had the answer no enough times, and we decided on 3, like 3 was enough, right? And that's arbitrary, right? We just made that up, right? But we said that's what we're going to do to protect everyone else, and say we've done what we can right now to help this person. And then we would say at that point, it's time for you to go back to a more contained environment. If you would like to come back to us when you're ready, you're more than welcome. Right? So it wasn't a decision where it was like, you can never come back again. It was, you're not ready right now. Can you come back later and we'll try it again? So that was our way of kind of balancing both sides of it, right? And we had to do something kind of simple and be able to make decisions, but we definitely tried to balance both sides of the dilemma with that process.
Great. Jerry, what about you? And I just want to give you props, Jerry. Jerry is live from a Starbucks for this podcast. Has done a really great job of self-regulating his mute button. So, hey, good job, my friend. Your technology knowledge is out the roof, baby. But if you, again, a very complex thing when we look at the criminal justice system. But if you were to pick one, maybe 2 things that you would like for us to consider in moving forward, what would those sort of be, at least to get us thinking on that topic?
Given the time we have, really all I want to say is that in Curt's example, it's almost like you failed and now you have to go back to a correctional place where they're going to start dealing with you in a punitive way. As opposed to, you require more external structure and more consistency, predictability, and in terms of the relational cues, many of these kids are just too triggered in a relational environment. And so we have to think about how to make that decision, whether it's 3 strikes and you're out, or whether more so is, what does this child need and how do we put him in an environment that both keeps them safe, keeps others safe, but also facilitates health, growth, and restoration of them. Not, you failed and now you get to this place where we don't really care about you anymore. Yeah. So I think that we can make really difficult decisions like removing a child from a home, to do it without devaluing or in some ways becoming punitive and letting the child's aggression, then we become counter-aggressive. Now we have power and we'll use it over you. So I think that we have to create systems that can provide children and youth and adults with a match between what they need internally and what's provided externally, without in some ways blaming them or in some ways using our powers to hurt them. That's the ultimate goal that I would think we could probably achieve, not respond to them, which would be, if I just leave you in this environment to hurt people and doing it, that's really neglect. So how do we respond, but in a trauma-informed, kind of trauma-sensitive way, to make sure that we're always trying to get the kind of outcomes we're trying to strive towards.
Excellent.
And now I'm going to mute.
Well done. Way to regulate, Jerry. Way to regulate. Russha, what about you, my friend? I know some of you think a lot about it, and unfair to ask you to talk about this in like 5 minutes or less, but what are some things, and again, you have sort of that insider perspective that we don't. What are some things that you think might move our system forward?
I think what Curt and Jerry said was so right on. It was such a big struggle when I ran facilities and worked with kids around what's the bottom line. If this is supposed to be a safe place for healing and growth, then at what point do we have to say to somebody, you can't stay here anymore? And it was was so hard. And so Jerry's follow-up to that was beautiful and very well stated. So I'm actually going to take a completely different direction with this. And what I would say in regards to what's a solution to start creating a more trauma-informed criminal justice system, it would be to provide some trauma-informed care for the employees, for the people who work in these systems, who work with the kids and adults and families that we serve, and help them learn some really effective self-care techniques and create a really empowered workforce where they're caring for one another. It's just like, the parents hear this all the time, the airplane analogy about you have to put on your air mask first before you put on your kids. But we need to be able to help criminal justice professionals put on their air mask every day, because there's very few jobs I think I could do that would match the trauma that I was exposed to when I did direct care for 15 years. And so then how do we really bring some very clear understanding to that reality and bring some really very easy systemic changes to create care for our employees.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you asking me and giving me opportunity to speak on that topic at the upcoming Colorado Collaborative Justice Conference, so that you're helping organize. So just put a plug out there for any of our listeners that might be going to that. So I'm looking forward to that. The only thing that I would add, and Russha, I want to thank you for your time. I like I said, when I started this out, this is probably part one of this discussion, because I'd really like to get criminal justice reform as such a central piece to, I think, the struggles of our country right now. And so my wish of what we would sort of do is be able to step back and ask what happened to us. We have to, I think, as a country with the highest, at least the statistics I see, the highest rate of incarceration in the world. And this really rings true to me as I'm going to Louisiana in a couple weeks, where I've seen a couple different statistics, but anywhere from 1 in 6 to 1 in 9 African-American males in New Orleans are in the criminal justice system. Is there something inherently wrong about us as Americans where we need to lock so many of us up? And if you look at how we do that racially, it's, to me, disgusting. And we failed because we get so reactive. We'd fail. I don't think we're at the point to step back and said, hey, what happened to this person? It's more like, what's happened to us? Well, why are we so reactive? And I think until we're able to step back a little bit and get that greater perspective, we're going to keep building prisons. And I don't think anybody, if you look at recidivism rates across the country, they're not effective interventions for changing behavior. Not that great work doesn't get done in certain areas. I'm not saying that, but when you look at the statistics, what's happened to us where we need to incarcerate such a large percentage of our population? And are we evil? Is there something inherently wrong with us that we have this population within our communities? Or are we being overly reactive? And is this an easy way out for us? So that would be my final thing. And of course, I end, like I always do, with a bigger question than probably would take 3 days to answer. But Russha, again, I want to thank you for your time. Curt, Jerry, it's great to get the band back. Like always, we'll have discussion questions. You can find the video. You can see the cool piece of artwork behind Jerry at Starbucks. Also, any other resources for this podcast at the traumainformedlens.org. And please join us next week as we celebrate 6 months of podcasting with episode 26. So we've hit a milestone, guys, and we were doing this for 6 months. And all I can say to my listeners is I have about a whole page of topics yet. So we're not going to be slowing down anytime soon. So Russha, again, our thanks to you, and gentlemen, great episode.
Thanks, Russha.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good week.
Thank you.